8 things that will happen to the human body in space. Contrary to what they show us in the movies, there are chances to survive. In Hollywood films, the fate of characters who die in space is spectacular and dramatic. The astronaut, who happened to be there without a spacesuit, turns into an ice statue, or bursts like a balloon, or both at once, which is enough for the screenwriter's imagination. But reality, as is often the case, is a little more banal and boring. This is what will really happen to some unfortunate fellow in the abyss of the universe. Number 1. Severe edema. When we are in the Earth's atmosphere, it presses on us with an average force of 100 kilopascals. This is about 1 kilogram per 1 centimeter too. But since the body consists of incompressible fluids and has its own internal pressure, the forces are balanced, and we do not notice the load. But in the vacuum of space, there is simply no atmosphere, so the internal pressure will begin to play against the astronaut. After about 10 seconds of being in a vacuum, the skin and muscles will swell and swell because the fluid in them will begin to expand. It hurts because the edema will be accompanied by multiple capillary ruptures and microhematomas, and the skin will turn blue. What definitely won't happen, contrary to popular belief, in a vacuum, a person will not explode, flying apart. The skin is strong and elastic enough to withstand the pressure of 1 atmosphere. The astronaut will monstrously swell up, experience severe pain, and it will be difficult for him to move. But he can't burst. In 1960, during a test stratospheric parachute jump, U.S. Air Force Captain Joseph Kittinger's right glove depressurized. His arm was swollen and completely useless. But the skydiver landed successfully, and while he was descending, the limb gradually returned to normal. Number 2. Sunburn. When we are on the surface of our home planet, the ozone layer protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. But in space, such protection is not expected, so people will be much faster to sunbathe without a spacesuit. It won't be the same as lying on the beach. A person who finds himself in outer space without special equipment will receive serious sunburn on exposed skin. This will also be very painful. Although ordinary clothing also protects well from ultraviolet radiation, a spacesuit is optional here. And if the astronaut is in the shadow of the planet, the sun will not harm him at all. What definitely won't happen, a person will not flare up, burn or char, as in the movie Inferno. Even under direct sunlight, the skin becomes corny reddened and covered with blisters. After some time, death from overheating could have occurred, but before that, the astronaut would have time to simply suffocate. Number 3. Blindness. Another danger that threatens in outer space is the blinding effect of bright sunlight. In sci-fi movies like the blockbuster Gravity, astronauts in spacesuits exchange meaningful glances with each other through the darkness of space. This is done so that we recognize the actors. But if you look at a real helmet, you will see a yellow polarizing filter on it that protects the eyes from ultraviolet radiation. Because of him, the face in the helmet is not visible at all. If you go into space without eye protection, damage to the retina from the ultraviolet radiation of the sun is more than likely, and this will lead to incurable blindness. What definitely won't happen, unlike what we saw in the movie Total Recall, in reality, the eyes will not pop out of their sockets in space. They sit firmly enough to withstand the opposition of vacuum and intracranial pressure. In 1965, this was tested on dogs during a pressure chamber test at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. The poor creatures, as noted in the reports of scientists, were very swollen, but their eyes and other organs remained in place. And if the exposure to vacuum was short-lived, up to 90 seconds, 10 to 15 minutes after being removed from the chamber, the animals came to their senses. Number 4. Frostbite of the eyes, mouth and nose. In general, in space it is easier to die from overheating than to freeze. The fact is that vacuum does not transfer heat well and is an excellent thermal insulator. Therefore, astronauts put on a special water-cooled suit under the spacesuit before going out into outer space. However, liquid-covered parts of the body in a vacuum, on the contrary, become cold very, very quickly. the water evaporates and carries away the heat with it. So open mucous membranes, eyes, mouth, and nostrils will quickly cool and may even become covered with frost. This will cause damage to the cornea and, again, blindness if you do not close your eyes in time. What definitely won't happen: cooling occurs only on surfaces covered with moisture. Due to the fact that convection in outer space is difficult, it is impossible for a person to turn into a fragile ice statue, as it is shown in science fiction films. The astronaut will experience cold for a short time, but this will pass as soon as the sweat from the skin evaporates. Further, the body will only heat up under sunlight. If the depressurization of the ship occurs very far from the sun, then the body of the victims will really cool down. But it will take hours, no instant glaciation. Number 5. Injury to internal organs. When going out into outer space without a spacesuit, one should not take care into the chest, although such an action seems quite natural. The fact is that due to a sharp drop in pressure, the victim of depressurization will inevitably experience barotrauma of varying severity. With a high degree of probability, the eardrums and sinuses will be damaged. In addition, if you do not exhale before decompression, you can get a rupture of the lungs. Gases in the intestines and stomach will also cause internal injury, which will be accompanied by spontaneous defecation, vomiting, and urination. This has also been tested on dogs. In general, when a spacecraft depressurizes, you should exhale as quickly as possible and clear the intestines. This will reduce the chance of internal injury. What definitely won't happen: unlike tender and delicate internal organs, limbs are at least not in danger. They will remain with a person, no matter what science fiction writers come up with. For example, in Ray Bradbury's story Kaleidoscope, the blunderer, who was outside the rocket, was first deprived of an arm and then a leg by a meteor shower flying past. However, in reality, due to the fact that the meteorites in the stream are separated by a huge distance, it is extremely unlikely to come across even one of them, and even two at once is like winning the lottery, although hardly anyone needs such a win. Number 6. Foaming saliva. Due to the absence of external pressure, liquids in a vacuum begin to boil and evaporate, although at the same temperatures on the surface of the Earth they behave normally. Watch the video above to see how the water works. It bubbles even though the jar is not heated. The already mentioned test skydiver Joseph Kittinger said that during the depressurization in the stratosphere before losing consciousness he managed to feel saliva boil on his tongue. It was not dangerous, but very unpleasant sensations. What is unlikely to happen? Unlike saliva, the blood of a person trapped in a vacuum will at least not froth, as portrayed in shocking sci-fi videos. The elastic walls of blood vessels are able to maintain a high enough pressure so that the boiling point of blood, about 46 C, even in outer space, is higher than body temperature 37 C. However, although the blood does not boil, individual small bubbles of gas will still form in it. Ebolism is to blame, an effect similar to what scuba divers experience abruptly emerging from great depths. And if one such bubble enters the brain, it will cause a stroke, and in the heart myocardial ischemia. Number 7. Irradiation. Vacuum and solar heat are not the only factors that try to kill you in space. Another danger is radiation. It is generously shared with the outside world by the sun, as well as other stars, galactic nuclei, quasars, and black holes. They regularly send streams of good towards our long-suffering planet. This is called the generic term cosmic rays. On the surface of the Earth, its abodes are protected by the powerful magnetic field of the planet. In space, this is not expected. Mars, for example, is deprived of such a field, so building a colony there will be another task. An unprotected astronaut risks serious radiation exposure by being bombarded by subatomic particles. So even if the poor fellow who fell out into outer space is promptly dragged aboard the ship, pumped out, and returned to Earth, there is a risk that he will soon die from radiation poisoning, or from cancer a little later. What can still happen? It is possible that the radiation will not cause significant harm to the astronaut. Of course, Naked he would receive a higher dose than in a spacesuit, because it traps alpha and beta particles. However, no protective suit, if it is not LEED, will still stop gamma radiation. If there were no solar flares during a forced walk around the near-Earth space, the victim will not gain a lethal dose of radiation. So, many members of the Apollo expeditions lived for quite a long time. On average, they received the same amount of radiation during a 12-day flight as they received from a chest X-ray. So radiation is not the main thing to worry about. Hanging out in space without a spacesuit. Number 8. Hypoxia. After an astronaut without a spacesuit is out of the ship, for about 10 seconds he will retain consciousness, a sober mind, and possibly presence of mind. But after that, he will begin to suffer from hypoxia, that is, oxygen starvation. His eyes will darken, he will experience convulsions, then paralysis, and pass out. In the Earth's atmosphere, people cannot breathe for about 1 to 2 minutes. Record-breaking diver Alex Vendrell somehow managed to last 24 minutes. However, in a vacuum, consciousness cannot be maintained for longer than 9 to 11 seconds. The reason is not lack of air, but lack of external pressure. Because of this, oxygen from the blood actually begins to be sucked out through the alveoli back into the lungs. It doesn't matter how much you can hold your breath. After about a minute and a half, the astronaut's brain will die from hypoxia. Since the bacteria living in the intestines will also soon die, the body will not decompose. Depending on how close the heat source, that is the sun, is, the remains will either mummify or gradually freeze. If the crash happened outside the gravity well of the Earth or another planet, the astronaut will drift in space for millions of years. It may even be found and placed in a museum by an advanced alien civilization. What can still happen? It is enough to have time to return the victim from the vacuum earlier than in 90 seconds, and it will be possible to pump it out. This was tested on dogs and monkeys by NASA specialists. Normalization of pressure, ventilation of the lungs with oxygen, and loading doses of pentoxifylline, a drug that improves the efficiency of red blood cells, will put the Po Man on his feet. Our advice to you is not to fly into space without a spacesuit.